Almost a year ago, on the 15th of April, armed conflict broke out between the Sudanese National Army and its former ally, the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The year-long civil war in Sudan risks triggering the world's largest hunger crisis. About 25 million people, that is approximately half of Sudan's population, is in dire need of all forms of humanitarian assistance, whereas more than 18 million people at this moment are grappling with acute food insecurity. Close to 15,000 people in Sudan have been killed and over 8 million people have been uprooted from their homes. And yet, despite such heart-rending statistics, the war in Sudan appears to be increasingly forgotten in the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Gaza war. So has the world turned its back on Sudan? Our next report puts the spotlight back on this forgotten war.
The year-long civil war in the Republic of Sudan has been described by top UN officials as one of the worst humanitarian nightmares in recent history. What precipitated this humanitarian crisis? The powerful paramilitary RSF, helmed by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo and the Sudanese army, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, had shared power with civilians after the 2019 overthrow of former strongman Omar al-Bashir, and in 2021 the army and the RSF joined hands together to stage a coup. But relations soured between the army and the RSF over the planned integration of the paramilitary RSF into the regular army, an internationally backed political transition plan. Tensions boiled over on the 15th of April last year, and since then, the brutal war has pushed the country towards a famine. So far, close to 15,000 fatalities have been recorded. More than 33,000 have been wounded, and the number of people displaced has reached 8.2 million. The lack of sufficient political will and attention has only made matters worse. Marking the one-year anniversary of the fighting in Sudan between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary RSF, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres didn't mince his words and blamed the warring generals.
Today marks an heartbreaking milestone, 1 year since the start of fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. And this is more than a conflict between two warring parties. It is a war being waged on the Sudanese people. It is a war on the many thousands of civilians who have been killed and tens of thousands maimed for life. It is a war on the 18 million people facing acute hunger and the communities now stancing down the terrifying threat of famine in the months ahead. The main problem is clear. There are two generals that have opted for a military solution and have until now obstructed all serious efforts of mediation.
Despite the mediation efforts and calls for a ceasefire, intense fighting has continued unabated. Sudanese army is reliant on air power and heavy artillery to counter the RSF's infantry advantage. The situation even prior to the conflict was grim, with about a quarter of Sudan's population facing acute hunger. An international conference was organized for war-torn Sudan in Paris on the 15th of April, exactly a year after war broke out in the northeast African country.
Even if today there are far too many conflicts and there are conflicts that are covered more by the press and diplomatic efforts, our duty was to make it clear that we are not forgetting what is happening in Sudan, that we remain mobilized, that there are no double standards. This is why France, the member of the Security Council and an ally of Sudan with Germany and the European Union, took the initiative of this conference to show our will, our determination to put an end to this crisis from which people are suffering, to give hope and to engage alongside Sudanese men and women. Today, significant resources have been mobilized. Thanks to you, and in total, we can announce that more than 2 billion euros will be mobilized for the women and men of Sudan. Before this conference, we had a commitment of 190 million euros. This evening, we are at 2 billion euros for Sudan.
Will the crisis in Sudan, increasingly crowded out of the global conversation by the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, be placed back on top of the agenda? A country of 48 million in the midst of a catastrophe fervently hopes the world's attention is not turned away from it.
Welcome back. The Black Sea nation of Georgia was rocked by 3 days of consecutive protests this week. Since Monday, thousands of Georgians have been taking to the streets in the capital city of Tbilisi and several other cities to protest against the controversial foreign influence bill. The protesters have said that the bill is inspired by authoritarian laws that neighboring Russia employs to crush dissent. The Georgian government has rejected any comparison to the Russian legislation, and it insists that this law actually boosts financial transparencies of NGOs that are funded by Western institutions. Our next report gets you more details.
Some 20,000 Georgians took to the streets in the Georgian capital Tbilisi on Wednesday evening after lawmakers advanced a controversial foreign influence law. 83 lawmakers from the ruling Georgian Dream Party voted in favor of the first reading of the bill in a vote boycotted by the opposition MPs. The bill must pass 2 more readings in the 150-seat Georgian parliament before becoming a law. The controversial bill requires organizations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence. Protesters say that the law mirrors a repressive Russian law on foreign agents used to crack down on dissent.
All of us here oppose the Russian law. We don't want our country to adopt such a law on foreign agents. It's offensive to us. We also don't want our country to follow Russia's path. In Russia, no one can express their opinion, and people are arrested for holding up blank placards. We don't want that to happen in Georgia.
Last year as well, the government's attempt to introduce a foreign agents bill was thwarted in the face of massive street protests. But earlier this month, the government announced that it would reintroduce the legislation, renaming it a bill on the transparency of foreign influence. In response, the Georgian president and the opposition figure Salom Zurabishvili had slammed the government's relaunching of the bill as sabotage.
Georgian Dream made its bid very clear, saying no to Europe on all fronts. We received a kind of retainer from Europe, and today Georgian Dream is busy sabotaging our path forward and our future. Sabotage is the only word that comes to mind.
Things took an ugly turn over the government's reintroduction of the bill on the 15th of April, when an opposition MP punched a ruling party lawmaker who had co-sponsored the bill. A former Soviet republic, Georgia had sought for years to deepen relations with the West. A 2023 poll found that more than 80% of 3.7 million Georgians supported joining the European Union. Last December, the European Union granted Georgia official candidate status, subject to extensive negotiations on various topics including democratic norms. The ruling Georgian Dream Party, though, has faced accusations of steering the nation towards closer ties with Russia. The fate of the controversial bill is a crucial test in deciding whether Georgia, 33 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, moves back closer to Russia or pursues a path of integration with the West.
Two stabbing incidents within a span of 3 days jolted Australia. The first incident took place at a shopping mall in Sydney's east on the 13th of April. 6 people were stabbed to death by a 40-year-old man before he was shot dead by the police. Barely 2 days later, 2 people were stabbed by a 16-year-old suspect at an Assyrian Christian church in southwest Sydney on the 15th of April. The Australian police declared the Sydney church stabbing as a religiously motivated terror attack. What explains this recent spurt in knife attacks in Australia? Our next report Here's more details.
Mass killings are rare, and violent crime is virtually unheard of in Australia. But one horrific stabbing incident on a Saturday afternoon changed all that. 6 people, 5 of them women, were killed in the attack at the sprawling Westfield Bondi Junction Mall complex in Sydney's east. Over a dozen others, majority of them women, were also wounded when a knife-wielding attacker, 40-year-old Joel Cauchy, rampaged through the busy shopping center. Though the attacker was shot dead by a police officer, Inspector Amy Scott, at the scene, the frightful incident left the survivors shaken.
I saw people running quite clearly in one direction, and behind them was a man with a knife running towards the people. He was running up to them, trying to, I don't know what he was doing. But then we went into the gym, because I was right outside that, and we're trying to close the doors to the gym when we heard the gunshots, which I understand now were the police, but at the time we didn't know that. So.
The attacker's father, Andrew Cauchy, was left distraught. He claimed that his son had a long history of mental illness and frustrations with women.
To you, he's a monster. To me, he was a very sick boy. Believe me, he was a very sick boy. Because he wanted a girlfriend, and he's got no social skills, and he was frustrated out of his brain.
Even as a grieving nation was trying to come to terms with the horrific incident, another brutal knife attack took place barely a couple of days later. 2 people, a bishop and a priest, were stabbed during a live-streamed church service. When a 16-year-old suspect rushed the dais at an Assyrian Christian church in southwest Sydney late Monday evening.
Shortly after 7 p.m. last night, police were called to a church in Wakeley in southwest Sydney in relation to reports that a male was stabbing the clergy inside that building. Police responded and arrested a young person, and he was restrained inside that building. Subsequently, as has been mentioned, at 1:35 a.m. this morning, after consideration of all the material, I declared that it was a terrorist incident.
The attacker, whose identity the authorities have not revealed, was almost immediately subdued by the agitated congregants and later taken into police custody. For 3 tense hours, more than 500 protesters gathered outside the church, clashed with the riot police, who battled to prevent them from entering the church and lynching the teen. Reportedly, the attacker was known to police, but was not on any terror watch lists. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stressed upon the importance of sanity and unity at this disturbing hour.
This is a disturbing incident. There is no place for violence in our community. There is no place for violent extremism. We are a peace-loving nation. This is a time to unite, not divide as a community and as a country.
An uneasy calm has returned to Sydney's multi-faith heartland. But the deployment of officers to several neighbourhoods is a grim reminder of the recent horrors.
And with that is the wrap on this edition of World at War. And if you want to reach out to me with any comments, feedback or suggestions, please feel free to do so on the ID that you're seeing on your screens. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh, and I'll see you again next week.